In about 15 seconds.
If everybody could take a seat, and especially Sean.
We'll wait, Sean. No, just kidding. All right. Good afternoon, everyone. I know this is nap time. I'm even myself feeling a little bit low energy, but hopefully, as Jack and I get warmed up here, we will reach a peak experience together. So the title of this conversation and dialogue, not only between me and Jack, but we really want to, in an effort to keep us all awake and engaged, make it more participatory. The title is The Nature of Consciousness and What to Do About It, Redux. And the reason it's Redux is because if you've been to Bishop's Ranch in years past, Aaron Weiss, former program coordinator, manager of PCC, and now he works in the ICP department. Aaron and I did a series of dialogues, 2 dialogues with the same title, part 1 and part 2, and you can find those on YouTube. And basically we're trying to bring together the theory of consciousness with the praxis or practice that would come along with it, and that's the what to do about it part. So what if this is the nature of consciousness? What does that mean for how we live, for how we act? Everything from ethics to politics to magic. Aaron got real deep into magic last time, and what he calls autoplasticity, which is the way in which, well, as Whitehead would put it, as we think we live. As we think, we change ourselves, and we become other than we were. So that selfhood, in some weird way, is a process of becoming other. To start things off, I actually want to ask a question of all of you. Raise your hand if you are conscious. Okay. Raise your hand if you know anyone else who is conscious. Okay. Is there anyone who's not raising their hand? Off Sheen. Okay. Interesting.
Are you sure that you're not raising your hand?
How can you be sure? Well, that's the next question is, how do you know? How do you know that you are conscious? Does anyone have a sense of that? No, it was an inclusive. Are you conscious, and do you know someone who's conscious? Somewhat conscious? Is that? Yeah. Okay, so there's levels of consciousness.
But how do you somewhat know?
Okay, Carol, what do you think?
Okay, so going out on a huge limb in front of all these brilliant people, I'm going to say, very simple step in. I'm aware, simultaneously being aware that there's an I.
Okay, good. So there's something meta about consciousness already, a reflexivity to it. Okay. Lily?
Say because it hurts, because I feel, I experience, almost like striking a limb for the reflex. It's not in the head, it's in.
Okay. Yeah, there's like a pathos to it. Yeah. Jake?
I find myself the subject of perspectival participatory.
Well, duh. Sean?
Sometimes I'm aware in the moment that I have a choice to either curse somebody or look at them with love. But there's an experience of choice in the moment.
Okay. Stephen?
A profound sense of what it is like to be moved.
What it is like, okay. Jesse?
I've been experiencing sensing.
Okay. Qualia, in other words, various sense modalities.
Sarah Lisa? Mm.
Well, hopefully I don't know if we'll be able to define it, but we'll have something to say.
I've never seen these slides before, so this is
this is the first time Jack and I are talking about our presentation. So, I mean, part of what I'm hearing is that there's a way in which to say that we are conscious is not just to say that we are conscious of the world, but that we are self-aware. Consciousness is somehow already reflexive. It's already, at least implicitly, self-consciousness. I'm reading this text right now about consciousness by the philosopher David Bentley Hart. Just came out. All things are full of gods, the mysteries of mind and life. And he's basically an idealist, and the way he captures this self-reflexive nature of consciousness is, he puts it this way: each of us is a me to whom the world is presented, but within each me there is also an I that knows that me and that renders it aware of itself. Right? So there's a me to whom the world is presented, and there is an I that knows that me. And for Hart, this is his way of rendering this distinction that Kant, if he doesn't introduce it, he at least makes it, I think, clearer than it had yet been understood, that there's a difference between our empirical self, or the empirical ego, and the transcendental ego, or consciousness as something transcendental as opposed to something empirical. And a lot of the times in contemporary consciousness studies and neuroscience, philosophy of mind, cognitive science, the idea would be that consciousness is just another empirical phenomenon that science can study and objectify and explain in some kind of causal mechanistic terms. That would be blind mechanism, would be the nature of consciousness. For others, it's a kind of spiritual mystery, and I'm going to suggest that that's sort of where Hart goes with this. This organic process isn't mutually exclusive. Consciousness could be an organic process, which is one way we might render what Whitehead and Bergson would suggest, and also a spiritual mystery. Let me see if this works. This is a neat tool that I'm using here. The philosopher Gabrielle Marcel, in his book Being and Having, explains this distinction between a mystery and a problem. And I think consciousness is mysterious, not in the sense that we can't come to know about it. In some sense, it is knowing itself. But here's how he puts it: a problem is something which I meet, which I find completely before me, but which I can therefore lay siege to and reduce. But a mystery is something in which I am myself involved, and it can therefore only be thought of as a sphere where the distinction between what is in me and what is before me loses its meaning and initial validity. Right? Mm-hmm. So we're participating in consciousness. We can't step outside of it so as to understand it like a mechanism. And I think to say that consciousness is transcendental is not to say it's transcendent, it's to say it always comes before and provides the condition by which we might come to know about anything else. What do you think about that, Jack?
Well, I want to provide an alternative perspective and maybe be a bit provocative and say that consciousness is not that important. Ooh. And that it is maybe less than our psychical being, and it is less than our physical and embodied being, and that, like Lily said, consciousness is really connected to feeling pain. And when we feel pain, we are conscious of the pain. But when we feel pleasure, we tend to fall into a blissful state that is less conscious, but is perhaps more expansive and involves a greater number of memories and psychological states and affects and feelings, not all of which are conscious in the sense that we would say something is in my field of vision, something is represented to me, and that I'm clearly, distinctly perceiving some image or content. So for Bergson and for Plotinus, who he draws a lot from on his idea of consciousness, he goes so far as to say as Plotinus is the first philosopher to think about consciousness, which I don't know if that's true. Doesn't seem true. But for Plotinus, when we have higher intellection, when we involve a greater amount of our psychic being, we are actually less conscious, and it's only when we're highly focused and distracting. So consciousness is in a sense distraction from the totality of being, either from the totality of our body and its feelings and its becoming and its place in the world and its inseparability from the world, as well as our entire past and the higher psychical levels of our being. So this is one possible way of thinking about consciousness. I mean, I think that, as Sarah Lisa said, we can kind of talk past each other for hours if we each have different definitions of consciousness. And I think, in fact, we all do, and do at different times. Because Bergson will say other things that completely go against this as well. He'll say consciousness is memory. Now, of course, we have memories right now that we're not conscious of. I'll get maybe to this diagram over here, which is meant to explain consciousness and the body and lived body and how they interact and become conscious. But consciousness would be a superficial element in this view. This isn't far from Whitehead.
No, I think he completely would agree with that.
Yeah.
See, in some sense, consciousness is a narrowing and a focusing and a selection among a much broader field of experience. And we can think of this in terms of like depth psychology. There's the unconscious, there's the personal and the collective unconscious. But on another level, we could also say that all of the archetypes that populate the collective unconscious are different kinds of consciousness that our ego consciousness is not aware of. And so it's a very slippery term.
Yeah.
And I really don't like, no offense, Sarah Lisa, but the question, can you define it? I don't know where to go with that. It's so frustrating to not have a definition, but also to try to define it, it seems like it prematurely closes the conversation. But I think for Whitehead, consciousness is derivative from a much more basic form of experience. And even human beings are not conscious in this more narrowly defined sense of the term most of the time. And actually, it can get in the way of what we're doing most of the time.
Yeah.
If you're overly conscious when you're driving a car, for example, you're probably going to be a more dangerous driver because you don't have that expanded, you have a spotlight form of consciousness and not this more diffuse sense of the whole field around you. And so I'm willing to go along with this perspective.
Yeah, well, I think a way to kind of build on what you're saying, the idea of habit and automatism, things that happen automatically. I think that these can be opposed to each other, right? So we have these sort of reflexes and automatic ways of reacting to our stimuli. And on the other hand, we have being consciously aware. So Sean brought in, I think it was Sean who brought in the idea of choice. I think a very deep understanding of these things sees them as very intimately connected. Sean actually earlier today mentioned, not that this is necessarily evidence, but a feeling of being in the womb, maybe a memory of being in the womb and consciously trying to beat his heart, well, to keep it beating, right? And which required attention as a fetus, but then eventually became a habit. And it just happened automatically. And now for the rest of his life, I'm assuming he doesn't have to think about it. So this idea of habit and consciousness would be that in our dynamic, flexible, living consciousness, we are adapting to the world. But as soon as we successfully start doing that, we become habituated and it becomes automatic. And even when I'm speaking, if I'm thinking about what I'm saying, I couldn't also be thinking about how to move my mouth, how to adjust the air coming out of my lungs to make it all come together properly. If I had to pay attention to all of those things, I wouldn't be able to think and be able to put my thoughts together, right? So we need automatisms, we need these things that happen automatically, but they certainly show us where consciousness retreats. So when I hear people talk about panpsychism, I think I agree with the general feeling behind the idea of panpsychism, but I would want to say, look at all these situations where if I was conscious of the guided process that I'm enacting, it would fail. So there has to be a way in which consciousness can at least diminish itself. And here we can actually pull on Bergson again and his idea of coming from Leibniz, infinitely small perceptions or infinitely small consciousnesses. So you could say, in principle, everything is conscious, but most is only infinitely small amount of consciousness. And this can grow into a full consciousness, but if it always does, and everything does in that way, we would become incapable of really having coherence and putting our experience together fully.
Yeah, I mean, let me lay out how I feel the contemporary academic study of consciousness, what it looks like in terms of I think there are basically four possibilities. There's physicalism, where the assumption would be that consciousness is ultimately reducible to some kind of mechanism in the brain. There would be a kind of dualism, where there's conscious properties and physical properties, and we're not quite sure how they relate, but we can't reduce one to the other. And there are still dualists. David Chalmers, for example, sometimes he's considering entertaining the idea of panpsychism, but he's, I think, more at home in a kind of dualist position. Chalmers is, of course, the one who comes up with this framework in the 90s of the hard problem of consciousness, that even if we knew everything there was to know about the physiological functions of the brain, we would still have this issue. Well, why is any of it conscious? And then the other two positions, which I think are where the action is now, and these to me seem like the live options: idealism and panpsychism. Now, there are various forms of both panpsychism and idealism. I don't know if Bergson, if you feel like he comfortably fits in either of those categories. Whitehead doesn't comfortably fit in either of those categories either. But it seems to me that most of the public fascination with this question of consciousness falls into one of these two latter categories. But within
I would
academia,
want to add that phenomenology is another option that maybe fits into both of those categories in certain ways, and is certainly a big player on the field, even though people ignore it oftentimes.
Sure, I would loosely fit that into idealism. It's a kind of transcendental idealism, though I know the phenomenologists aren't affirming an ontology, and these are different ontologies, but the implied ontology of phenomenology seems to be mind-based.
That's tricky, but well, I would want to add one thing to this, is that in our title, like, what is consciousness and what should we do about it? I mean, I think that one thing we can think there is, like, what does consciousness do, right? And what could consciousness do, and what would we be able to do about it with our consciousness if we were going to do something about it? And I think that the one thing Merleau-Ponty, for instance, points out is that the idealist will tend to make consciousness do everything, right? So we constitute the world with our consciousness. Everything comes together through these already established structures. The empiricist, on the other hand, tends to become an epiphenomenalist, and consciousness does nothing. And the thing is that consciousness, if it does everything or if it does nothing, either way, we kind of ruin and lose what consciousness is, I think. So,
yeah. Well, yeah, it can both be helpful to define it very specifically.
Well, I could say what it does, maybe, or at least try and
do it.
give a throw at that. And again, I'm going to be drawing from Bergson because that's who I think with most of the time. If consciousness exists, it has to have a purpose. It has to do something. It has to play a role. I think that the epiphenomenalism just is incoherent, right? So I think consciousness really,
Can you say why it's why do you think epiphenomenalism is incoherent? I mean, I have thoughts, but why is it incoherent?
I mean, it doesn't do anything. It has no, like, if it's evolving for some kind of purpose and emerging for some reason, that doesn't make any sense because it doesn't do anything.
A physicalist would say it can't do anything because there's causal closure and consciousness doesn't fit into our picture of the material
and then
world.
you usually resolve it into nothing, like a Dennett, and just say that it doesn't exist. But I don't know. I mean, we feel things. Why do we feel things? There's got to be a reason for this, right? And I think Bergson gives a really good answer here, which is that it's practical. It actually serves a function. It has a utility, which again diminishes what consciousness is, and it's kind of what I'm trying to get at with the expanded psychic being, far exceeding our consciousness. But consciousness allows us to be engage our attention in a way that is practical, that is for survival. And if it doesn't have this pragmatic orientedness, then it wouldn't exist.
Yeah, I like that. It seems to me that physicalists will either say they'll be eliminativist and say, well, consciousness is a word that we talk about, but it's really just a trick that it's a spell we cast on ourselves and can get confused because we speak in these ways. But as science advances,
Cast on ourselves.
Yeah, we get bewitched by our own words, and that as neuroscience advances, instead of talking about emotional qualities or will or any of these things, we'll just talk about behavior among neurons and neural circuits. So that's the eliminative materialist position. And as a form of physicalism, I think it's the only one that's at least internally coherent in terms of its logic.
But it's insular in some way.
It's inadequate for our actual experience, but at least the argument, makes sense. Then there's the emergentists who want to say consciousness comes into existence when nervous tissue gets complex enough. And the problem there is, well, you could have strong emergence where there is some kind of a top-down influence that our conscious decisions would have on our behavior. And then there would be weak emergence, which is something more like epiphenomenalism, where it's just this steam whistle on the train, as T.H. Huxley put it, and can't actually change our behavior. And the problem with epiphenomenalism, I would say, is that if you want an evolutionary explanation for how consciousness emerged, it's going to need to have some effect on the behavior of the organism, or it can't be selected for. And William James points this out already in Principles of Psychology, and he thinks actually some kind of panpsychism would allow us to better understand the evolutionary process and how an organ as complex of the brain could have come to exist. I mean, obviously, consciousness wasn't as rich and intense when life first emerged, but he thinks, James would say, it had to have been there, at least in germ, for an organ as complex as the brain to ever have evolved, that allows it to intensify and be enhanced. But and so with the physicalist positions, either eliminativism, epiphenomenalism, or emergentism, I think with the latter two positions, the reason I think eliminativism is more, at least logically consistent, is that epiphenomenalism and emergentism both end up being forms of dualism.
Yeah.
Because if it's epiphenomenal, it's this other sort of ghostly thing that we can't explain, but the epiphenomenalists at least don't deny our direct and immediate experience of feeling pain and believing that we can direct the course of our actions, but nonetheless they insist on a mechanistic understanding of the physical world. Whereas emergentists want to affirm that we can somehow change the behavior of our organism, but you're left, first of all, having to explain what is emergence if not magic. A totally new ontological order of existence come into being. So let's talk then about...
Well, can I say something about emergentism? Because I think it's super interesting.
Yeah.
And I agree with the problem that you just raised, but I also think that there are certain aspects of emergentism that are undeniable. We integrate our thoughts in a certain way, and a sui generis whole comes about that can't be reduced to the parts.
Mhm.
Now, I think that is something that consciousness makes possible. So I think we can say that emergence is one of the primary types of organization within consciousness, but that consciousness itself is not an emergent property from a lower level of
Yeah.
something. So I think there's a really like fine line within the emergence literature there that isn't just strong and weak emergence, but has to do with how irreducible certain integrations are within psychical experience. And this doesn't have to just be consciousness. Our habituation and our behavior is a way of integrating a multiplicity of movements into a unity that is greater than the sum of the parts and is unexplainable through the individual parts. And this is the basics of like Gestalt psychology, the idea that a melody, for instance, it obviously is in all of the notes. It's not transcendent to them in some way. It's not separate than them, but it is also irreducible to the notes, right? So I think that we have to be very careful how we understand emergence, whether it is a integral part of consciousness or whether it is the cause of consciousness. If that,
Yeah, emergence as an explanation of how consciousness might come out of physics conceived mechanistically.
yeah,
I don't think that works.
Yeah.
But if somehow consciousness or experience is pervasive, then clearly emergence is happening all the time, or we wouldn't have a unified experience of anything. And so there's another sense of emergence that I think is, it's an irreplaceable concept, but I think it's easier to understand how something fundamentally experiential could give rise to new wholes and these forms of integration, whereas it's much more difficult to understand, if not impossible, which is why it's a hard problem, to get consciousness out of particles or fields or anything that doesn't already have some kind of interiority.
Yeah. And if I could say one more along these lines, reacting to something that you said playfully and in dialogue, that is about evolutionary advantage, because I think without understanding some evolutionary advantage to consciousness, like you said, we're not going to have like made sense of it, or at least this is a problem that we can pose to the epiphenomenalists, for example. But I think that we also need to keep in mind that this is a new form of reductionism in some way, right? And in a way, Bergson is reducing consciousness to this and wants to say, but there's more, right? But I think we don't have to necessarily do that. We can say there's surplus evolutionary advantage, and that surplus evolutionary advantage can form something sui generis again and open new possibilities. So it doesn't have to be that consciousness is only there for our survival.
Oh, totally.
Yeah. Just a point of clarification.
Let me lay something out related to that, and then I think maybe it would be great to go into more depth into Bergson's understanding of memory and consciousness. In terms of trying to come up with an evolutionary explanation for consciousness, I think one of the leading theories in neuroscience and cognitive science right now is called predictive processing, and there are different schools of thought that fall under that umbrella, like the free energy principle, the Bayesian brain, active inference. There are these different approaches that are all basically saying that what any organism and what our nervous system is basically engaged in doing is trying to align its predictions about what's going to happen next with the evidence coming from sense data. And Bayesian brain is based on Bayesian statistics, and it's this formalism for being able to adjust priors or assumptions and expectations about what's going to happen based on new evidence that's coming into the senses. And a lot of these theorists will say that our conscious experience is actually a kind of controlled hallucination. We experience our expectations, and evolutionarily speaking, what the brain is trying to do is minimize surprisal is the word that a free energy principle theorist would use, which means to minimize the difference between the prediction and the sense data. And so what that suggests is it's a kind of reduction of what life is about. Life as mere survival, life as merely trying to minimize errors in the predictions that we're making about what's going to happen next relative to the sense data that comes in. And from my perspective, it seems like to understand life as more than just a survival mechanism, we also want to understand life in terms of its desire to thrive and to intensify its experience. And there are aesthetic lures that are part of the evolutionary process, even for Darwin, with sexual selection, not just natural selection. And so in addition to a principle of free energy, we need like a principle of eternal delight, to draw on Blake's comment, like energy is eternal delight. Or instead of just a principle of error minimization, we need a principle of erotic maximization. Like, there's life really wants to deepen its intimacy with reality. And I think a lot of these approaches are reducing evolution just to natural selection. I think there's another vital principle of some kind, perhaps, not vitalism of the sort that Bergson critiques, but I think an imminent drive to diversify and to intensify experience.
Yeah, I would love to build on this, because I think that what I'm trying to get at, and what I really like, I'm being a bit provocative here with limiting what consciousness means severely in this Bergsonian sense, but what does it mean to have an intense experience, right? What is the intensity of our psychic being? And I'm avoiding the word consciousness, right? And I think that we should avoid the word consciousness to some degree if we have a very specific meaning of it, which is something that we are consciously aware of as attentive to, something that is representationally there. There is an image, something that we're actually enacting presently. Because so much of our experience is beyond that. There is movements beginning in the body that haven't started yet, but that we are aware of their potential to be unfolded. There is a whole horizon of nascent images, memories that we can feel their relevance. They're pulling us in a certain direction. When you forget something and you try to remember it, there's a certain feeling of a presence of something that isn't there in an image, that we don't know what it is. We're not conscious of it, but we are aware of it without being conscious of it, and we're moving towards it. And actually, all the time, we feel that surrounding our consciousness. And Bergson gives the example of like listening to language, or listening to someone speak. If I say, "What is it to," and I stop, right? Well, what I've done is I've started a movement, and a movement with a certain direction and a certain sense to it. I'm being inquisitive, right? What is it to understand consciousness? Okay, so now I've formed a phrase where I've started a certain energy of movement of thought in a certain direction, and I've narrowed the horizon of where that's going by giving you these next signposts on the path of this movement. And but what is really going on there is much more than just the image or the sound or the comprehension of a sentence or what's read on paper. There's so much that is not directly in our consciousness. And if we reduce consciousness to what is present to consciousness, then I think we're never going to understand what it is to experience things, to have, to be there, to have experience. I mean, I think this is one of the major problems that besets consciousness research these days. And we like, there's a great, there's a book that analytic philosophers love that is about memory. It's called Memory. Sven, somebody came out with it. And I was really excited because I found out that analytic philosophy was getting into memory. And I scour the book to see if they ever get outside of representational thinking, and they don't. And I think that this just besets the understanding of memory or consciousness or any of these things.
Can you explain what you mean by representational thinking? I mean, it's related to the idea of consciousness as a controlled hallucination, that we only have access to an inner model of some external world that we only know as an inference that it might be out there. You might be out there, but all I have is my model of you.
Well, I think it's visually conceived for the most part. It's a picture, but it's not an image in the dynamic sense of poetic imagery, right? If you're hearing poetic imagery, you're not really thinking about the details of the image, at least not alone. Like that's going to help the thought get moving, but it's not all there is, right? But if we think like, I don't know, I parked my car over there. Okay, there's the me representation, which is a symbol. There's the car, and there's the there, and then we put those together, and that's the meaning. We've exhausted it. There's no ambiguity or subtlety in it, right? So I'm not saying that we don't have representations, that we don't think representationally, or that we can't represent our thoughts. But this is what, like Bergson would say, consciousness far exceeds the present state of the brain at any moment in its movement. But also the psychic being far exceeds the conscious content of our experience at any moment.
Mm-hmm. Right. So I would love to lay out briefly Whitehead's definition of consciousness, which requires a bit of background. I mean, a little bit of metaphysics to build up to that. And I know you want to lay out Bergson's view.
If we have time, it's not.
When did we start? What time did we end? 4:30? 4:15? 4:30. Okay, great.
So we'll see. We don't need to, but I could go over it very briefly, and that could at least get people excited to maybe take a Bergson class in the future.
Yeah. Why don't you go first?
No, you go first, please.
No, okay.
I just talked a lot.
So I think of Whitehead's approach to this question as a form of panpsychism, a variety of panpsychism. Whitehead never uses the term, however, though he will say things like, outside of the experience of subjects, there's nothing, 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 bare nothingness. So that's pretty insistent that experience is, and subjective experience is fundamental. But of course, by subjective experience, he doesn't just mean a human's experience. He doesn't just mean a single cell's experience. He means that the world itself is made of the experience of subjects. And so for Whitehead, his term for what these experiencing subjects are would be actual occasions of experience. And these occasions are really emergent products of their feelings or their prehensions, and this is very much related to Leibniz's idea of little perceptions. Whitehead uses the term prehension to refer to a non-conscious, non-cognitive feeling. And by non-cognitive, he means there's no knowing occurring yet. There's no consciousness or self-consciousness occurring in the simplest actual occasions of experience. But what is happening is feelings of what's already occurred in the past are growing together. These are physical feelings or physical prehensions growing together into the formation of a new subject. And so already you should notice that this is kind of the inverse of how we're usually thinking about consciousness, where there's a subject that then has experience. Whitehead is saying that feelings flow out of the past and gather together into a new subject. And so there's the flowing of the past into the present to form a new subject, and there's also a different kind of feeling or a different kind of prehension that Whitehead describes called conceptual prehension, which rather than feeling what's already been actualized in the past, like physical prehensions, conceptual prehensions are feeling what's possible. Conceptual prehensions are feeling eternal forms, or what Whitehead calls eternal objects. These are the sort of penumbra of alternatives that aren't yet being felt in the past, but may become part of how this subject, it's kind of a larval subject that's growing into existence as a result of the unification of these different types of feelings. And as soon as this subject achieves its novel perspective, integrating the feelings of the past and ingressing other alternative possibilities, and the degree to which alternatives can be ingressed depends on the grade of the occasion. In a conscious human being, an actual occasion can explore, we have almost infinite imaginative freedom to explore alternative possibilities to what we've already felt in the past. Now, consciousness in this whole process only comes in, Whitehead says, at a very late stage of this process, which all of this is concrescence. That's his word for this process of the growing together of feelings. Consciousness arises very rarely in even in human life, in somewhat rare circumstances, when there's a special kind of comparison that occurs between what's given in the past, let's say given in our perception of the world around us, and an awareness also of what he calls a propositional feeling, which is a bringing together of a physical prehension of other actualities in the environment with novel possibilities of what could be or what may be. So consciousness is a feeling of the comparison, or what Whitehead would call an affirmation, negation, contrast. And I think there's a little bit of Hegel in there. And so when we're conscious for Whitehead, it means that we're not just aware of what's happening, we're aware of the fact that what's happening could have happened otherwise. There comes in the freedom. And there might be the germ of consciousness, at least all the way down to the origin of living organisms, biological organisms, even if experience or prehension and feeling goes even lower than that, down into electromagnetic pulses of radiation. But that's Whitehead's picture. Consciousness is only arising very late in the game in these processes of concrescence, whereas what's fundamental really is feeling.
Yeah. And I think
one more thing I'd say is, in terms of memory, Whitehead would say that memory, when we think of that term colloquially as conscious recall of something which has occurred before, he would say memory is consciousness of causation. And causation for Whitehead is all about the transmission of feelings from moment to moment.
Yeah, I think that this maps with Bergson. It would take a lot to unpack that. I'm going to explain a little bit about Bergson. I'm not going to connect it to every point, but I think that they do map. And you mentioned that in this process, there's a sort of, I would say, halo or kind of haze or nebulosity of potentials. And I would say we can't think that we have 1,000 pictures in front of our mind at once. But at the same time, we're aware of them all, we appreciate them all, we have a sense of them. And I wouldn't want to reduce that to consciousness of an image. And I think that this is if consciousness is the thing that's coming out of this process, the process is more than just consciousness. And I think that is the idea that Bergson is really getting at. I don't know if you want to quick respond to that. Okay, I'm going to go to the diagram. Meet me over at the diagram. All right, here we are. So, oh no, okay. Here, let's move the diagram. So Bergson devised this cone diagram, inverted cone on a plane. This is partially derived from his reading of Plotinus, which I'm not going to go into more, but just going to say that. So anyway, let's look at the diagram. This plane at the bottom here is the universe, the whole universe in its becoming in the present. It's a plane of movement, he says. So M here stands for movement, and the point is your body. Your body in its inseparability from the becoming of the universe. Movements come in and they go out, and everything is interrelated and interconnected to varying degrees, but everything is connected to everything, another idea that Whitehead has as well. Moving up the cone, we are moving in degrees of tension, and he wants to understand consciousness as a tension between our lived body and our, what he calls integral or pure memory, which we'll say is up here, not necessarily on this top plane, and the cone kind of keeps going, and that question leads into questions of the memory of the universe and things like that, which we talked about earlier. But we have varying degrees of tension within consciousness. So the lower we are down here, we have habits, things that are enacted automatically. They're highly contracted. They imitate the movement of matter, right? If one thing bumps into another thing in matter and then it keeps going, it's almost like that. It's like a reflex. So S stands for schema. body schema, the organizations of our body that we have prepared. You know, if you're a musician, you have all of these abilities to mechanically move your body ready to go. And they are a certain degree of contraction of our psychical tension, of our consciousness. In the middle here will be consciousness, which I'll talk about in a second, but then the plane up here, plane R, is reverie, dream, or imagination. It is our consciousness in its most relaxed state, its most expanded state, where all of our past becomes equally available to some degree. The more tensely we are related to the physical world in the present, the less of our past is coming into play. And this is important. You know, if you're driving down the street, you need to not have all of your memories distracting you. I mean, you can do it kind of by muscle memory to some degree, but you also need to be not distracted, right? If you're gonna, like if I started thinking about some random memory right now, I would lose my train of thought. So I can't be up in the plane of reverie, but we can get there, right? We can all sort of do certain experiential deep dives to put ourselves at different points on this diagram. And moving beyond the plane of dream or the reverie, we would have pure memory. And we can think of this in terms of near-death experiences, although that's not the full reality of it. But in a near-death experience, what sometimes happens is past life review. All the details of our past come back. The idea is that every moment of past reality is preserved in itself outside of space and time, not just in the brain. And that is up here. So consciousness is a tension between all possible past moments and the present becoming of our body. And they call for each other to some degree. There's a descent, and this is where Plotinus is going to come in. The ideas, the forms for Plotinus are descending to some degree, but they can't realize themselves on their own. They need a attitude of the body. They need the body to actually adopt them in some way. And actually, there's tons of memory examples where it's much easier to remember something if you're having a hard time to actually get your body involved. The body somehow calls forth memories and is filled by them. And he looks at cases like in hypnosis where you can suggest certain sensations, and these sensations actually realize themselves, so that you feel the sensations, there's physiological reactions to them and things. He says this is what memory does. It's not, there's no physical cause of this. It is a descent of these immaterial realities into the physical reality. So it would take a lot of time to unpack this more. We want to have time for questions, but this is the basic schema. So consciousness is here. It is somewhere between a motor habit that we enact immediately without thinking about it, an automatism, and a dream state where we are led from one memory to the next without really having a coherence between them. Mm-hmm. Okay.
One final connection I want to make, and then we'll open it up. Thanks for that, Jack. Earlier today, after Kate's talk, I believe, Jake came out with this phrase, dynamic mnemonic ontology. And, you know, when thinking about what I was describing in terms of concrescence and the growing together of these feelings to achieve a moment of actual experience, sometimes conscious, but only if that affirmation, negation, contrast occurs, right? Our stream of consciousness, moment by moment, and like the course of an entire human life, for Whitehead is not just one continuous becoming. And this is where there might be a difference with Bergson. For Whitehead, experience comes in these pulses, and each novel pulse is going to include and be internally related to prior pulses of experience, and a continuity will be achieved, but only through this kind of process of repetition and reiteration. Mm-hmm. And each moment is cumulative in the sense that it's including everything that came before in the past. But I think of Whitehead's ontology in some ways as this dynamic,
Mhm.
mnemonic ontology. And Whitehead's phrase for, what our stream of consciousness is would be a kind of historical root of these moments of becoming.
Mhm.
And in order to affect the future, and maybe this gets a little bit to what to do about it, like our freedom, Whitehead would say, to influence the future actually requires dying to the present.
Mhm.
We make a decision in the present as to how we'd like to affect the future, but the consciousness in that present moment has to die, and it will be reborn, but in a new form in the next
Yeah.
moment. It's only by perishing that we influence the future. Like there's this line in one of Goethe's poems, "Die and become," and I feel like that's the underlying spiritual message of this
Mhm.
view.
Mhm.
Now I know Bergson thinks of duration or lived time as being continuous, and there aren't these breaks that
Mm.
Whitehead seems to introduce,
Mhm.
but it's a heterogeneous
Yes.
becoming.
Mhm.
I don't know if you want to say a little bit about the difference
Yeah,
between the
I
two.
think that the claim of continuity, and then like Merleau-Ponty calls it time of fusion, I think that this can be really misrepresented, and I think it would be a misrepresentation to oppose them on this, actually. Bergson talks about, in Zeno paradox, they have the same kind of approach to Zeno's paradox, that there are bounds, indivisible bounds, but that they each have their own kind of droplet of experience, like James says. So I think that this is, and he also thinks that there's discontinuity within continuity. I think continuity is actually one of the most profound concepts that we get from Aristotle, actually. And every continuity involves heterogeneity, but also interpenetration. So every moment of our experience, for Bergson, is a becoming that is related to all of our past and is like unique, you could say, monad on the past, but it is also continuous. So this is his idea in an introduction to metaphysics, that we cannot say that it's one or many. It is both one and many. It's continuous and it's discontinuous, but it's not a discrete, it's not a completely discrete discontinuity. And I don't think that's true for Whitehead either. And each one, this goes to Leibniz in the monadology. And Leibniz gets his profound notion of continuity from Aristotle as well. I don't think Aristotle has fully worked out the understanding of continuity, because it means evolution and radical novelty. So he kind of like can't figure it out. We see this in like physics for when he's talking about time. He confronts the like fact that their novelty is not just a monsterization or something like that. But he can't look at it, and he moves on and says, well, let's not think about it. And then he also does the same thing with the idea of entropy. And he says, well, like the God that is the intellect of everything prevents there from being novelty and entropy and these kinds of things. Anyway, that's a far field, but I think that we could say a lot more about continuity. And Bergson says that continuity is rudimentary consciousness, or that it's a kind of experience, and that because movement involves continuity, it involves consciousness, and that necessarily means a heterogeneous unity.
Reminds me of something Whitehead says about the concept of togetherness. And just think of togetherness as in the most general possible sense. And he says, there is no other kind of togetherness except experiential togetherness. And this relates to what we were saying about emergence earlier, that it makes sense.
Peirce could be brought in here too.
Right, cynicism was my word, if anyone was paying attention, which just is Peirce's term for continuity.
Which he gets from Aristotle.
Nice.
Anyway.
All right, well, we've reconciled Whitehead and Bergson. I'm happy about that. Let's take some questions and comments. Thanks, Larry.
You want to call him first?
Jesse.
So I have this very strong feeling about, we talk of panpsychism and we talk of pan-experientialism. And so I feel like I want to take a stand for pan-consciousnessism. And you know, kind of thinking of it from the Whiteheadian perspective, because if there is emergence, then that suggests duality. And the way that process organism works, I mean, there is a physical and there is a mental pull for everything, for every occasion. And so then it seems to me that to avoid emergence, there has to be this idea of, consciousness is the ground of being. And then with different grades of occasion, that there's just, a kind of touching, as you said, like a germ of consciousness, even if it's just initially just a touching into the mental pole. And then as things evolve, then you've got higher grade occasions, which actually, by Whitehead's definition, included consciousness, a kind of decision making and intellectual feeling, and then those come into satisfaction as actual occasions. So then consciousness is in the field of everything because those occasions exist. So anyway, I know I brought this up with you before, Matt, but I just wanted to throw that idea out.
You have something to say?
Yeah, I have a little. Well, I would say that I don't think necessarily emergence needs to be dualistic. I think it's possible that we can have something that is organismic and feeling based, but that isn't fully consciousness, but from it emerges consciousness. So that was the kind of way I was trying to save part of emergentism. But anyway, I don't know.
Yeah, I feel, is it still on? Yeah, I feel like, when I was describing emergence at first, I was, again, just specifically talking about getting mind out of matter, basically.
Yep.
But if we're thinking about if we have a pan-experiential ontology, of course, emergence is happening all the time. And I don't think it needs to imply dualism either, even though if we're talking about mind coming out of matter, then it does imply dualism. But in terms of whether we can say consciousness goes all the way down, I mean, we can define the term in different ways, I like that flexibility. I think sometimes Whitehead's very specific definition makes me feel like I have handcuffs on and can't really play with concepts in a way that I would like. And any systematic philosopher is going to do that to you. Maybe, system isn't necessarily putting handcuffs on you, but it's allowing you to build a very complicated device for seeing and understanding the world. And it's going to blind you to other ways, But when we talk about a mental pole in Whitehead's context, it doesn't necessarily mean consciousness. Even he'll talk about the vibratory patterns that we can see in electrons or photons, and that's already evidence of the mental pole and what he'll call conceptual reversion, because it's not just, like a light ray is not actually a ray, it's a vibratory pattern. It's actually two waves moving perpendicular to each other. And so there's some differentiation from what just occurred in the past, but then a recanalization. And so it's like the mental pole at that low grade of occasion is introducing just the minimal form of contrast so as to allow there to be something. But whether it's conscious or not depends on how we define that word.
Can I say one last quick thing?
Right.
I want to say one more thing about Bergson that I think can illuminate at least my thought on this, is that consciousness is duration. It's something that involves an unfolding in time. And so when we hear like a piano note, we're actually hearing like hundreds of vibrations a second, which sounds like something unchanging. It's just this single note, right? And consciousness in a way needs to reverberate in order for it to become conscious. So we can have fleeting psychical feelings, but if those psychical feelings don't continue to vibrate for some amount of time, it won't become a sensation. So if you open your eyes and close them fast enough, your eyelids don't move fast enough to do this, but you can do it with a light or something like that, you're not going to perceive anything. It needs to actually occupy a certain duration. It needs to be continuous over time. So perception, it happens that way, and for consciousness, it happens that way. Like if you have a memory pop up for 1 second, it can be gone so fast that you didn't grasp it. It didn't fully become conscious. So that's maybe one way of thinking about the emergence.
Yeah. So I wanted to introduce a couple of concepts into the discussion. One is, we're talking about consciousness in this sort of unified way, but there could be different elements, like in McGilchrist thought about having sort of a left brain orientation towards consciousness, which I think gets to the Paul-Friston and Bayesian, create that model, go out there and minimize surprise because you're trying to execute and grab something. But then what's going on in the right brain, and things like intuition and what comes up from there. And as Matt knows, we carried on this dialogue in a paper I wrote about, one of the theories of consciousness is this whole thing between Hameroff, who's an anesthesiologist, and Penrose, and the fact that proto-consciousness sort of emerges from the collapse of the wave function. And so there is this, when the wave function collapses and you go from wave to an actual moment, it's sort of like, there's consistency with compressors. When compressors collapses into that actual occasion, there is that proto-consciousness. So the question is, what Hameroff and Penrose are saying, that in the brain can actually, in the microtubules, control that in a superposition for an extended period of time, where you can sort of aggregate all those proto-consciousness into stream of consciousness. So one of the things that we have to think about is, what is mind exactly versus consciousness? And if before the collapse of the wave function, there's infinite potential, and in some ways is mind accessing that infinite potential that gives this expansive ability of all the different choices and access to all the different things. But then when it collapses into physicality, it's defined, but then you go on and get to that next moment. So I guess the question is, how, do you all see a differentiation in forms of consciousness, and sort of where the original proto-consciousness comes from, experience, or whether the collapsed wave function is that part of concrescence, and then can that be organized into a less prescriptive reaching and manipulation of the world, into more of an expansive, intuitive thought, because you're spending time with the infinite possibility of the quantum space before it collapses.
Do you want to go? Or, I would say that I think that this collapsing idea is precisely what I'm trying to get at, that the larger psychical activity that's going on isn't just what's conscious. And so consciousness is this integral moment, or integral part, but it's not the whole.
Yeah, I think also when we talk about the field of potentiality, when the wave function hasn't yet collapsed, I don't know that it's ever infinite. There are certain things that are more probable than other things, because there's always a past. And so we're always limited to some degree by what the physical pole has to inherit. And every new wave function, if you want, or the mental pole phase of concrescence, is going to have a certain field of possibilities open up in light of what's been received in the physical pole from the past. And it could be that we're talking about a large but still finite array of what we can do next, at least in terms of what can be physically realized by the decision that constitutes that actual occasion. In terms of the imaginative freedom that we can explore just as conceptual prehensions, maybe that is infinite.
There's mind, like the openness, but then the reality of the collapse.
Yeah, I think, did Huxley come up with mind at large, or is that Bergson's phrase originally?
I don't remember that phrase.
I guess it's Huxley. I'll just Bateson.
Oh, okay.
Huxley uses it in his Doors of Perception, which was in the 50s. But in any event, we could think of mind in Whitehead's terms as, well, he would say God, like where the possibilities, they're not just floating out in empty space, they're in the mind of God. And each moment we're drawing on that divine mind in order to ingress relevant possibilities. And so we might distinguish between mind and consciousness, which would be a finite, focused, form of experience that's not taking in every possibility at once, which wouldn't really be conscious, which is why the primordial nature of God, according to Whitehead, is not conscious, because it is infinite in terms of all the possibilities with no actual, nothing actualized yet. Consciousness requires finitude, and value even is realized as a result of that finitude for Whitehead, being limited by a past and achieving something definite.
Yeah. That's the idea of tension of memory in Bergson. Yeah.
Does memory have to be a sense of the physical whole? Does memory have to be the sense of the physical whole as something that is actually transpired and happened? And so therefore, when I hear you talking about memory, and
I should say pure memory, to be
memory as opposed
clear.
to
A recollection.
A bit of something that's happened in the past.
Mm-hmm.
So therefore, that would have a physicality, a physical dimension.
Well, I think if it had a physical pole dimension to it, it would be causing something. At least in Bergson.
But that's what you're saying. That's why your body feels it.
But then that would be on the side of like habit memory and embodied memory. Anyway, we could talk about that more. Do we have time for? Okay.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Jack.
Thank you. That's fun, man.